I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Nagy. I am a relatively, well, I'm not a new sysadmin. I am new to the Legal Information Institute this past year. Today, I'm going to present on something called the defense in depth philosophy. This is something put forth by a lot of security experts, most notably the ones that are over at the SANS Institute. And if you've never visited their spot, I suggest you do. If you ever need a clearinghouse or some information about what's going on, what the newest threat is, what the most scanned port is, their website is an excellent resource. And what defense in depth basically is it's layers of defense that you can apply to yourself or to your organization to keep something safe in the very center. And the way it's usually displayed is in this nested circle. And at the center of the circle is this data or this information that you have that you hold important for whatever reason. And the next layer outside is the application layer, the program layer, if you will, of perhaps a fault. The layer above that is the host, the actual box it sits on, whether it be a desktop or a server. And then above that you have a network layer. And this is what we're trying to protect with security. This is the idea of a layer of defense, is that you start and apply layers or to the defense to these layers of abstraction. And the reason we do this is because of a single point of failure idea, and that if something should fail, or if somebody should be able to bypass one layer of security, you would have yet another layer behind it that would at least detect or perhaps thwart what they were trying to do. In the defense in depth model, there's three core principles, and this usually is what you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect one or multiples of this. The first thing is confidentiality, and in the legal environment, in any academic environment, we've all met an extremely paranoid faculty user who doesn't want his stuff put wherever or however, or an extremely paranoid student for whatever reason. The confidentiality in academia is getting a little more pronounced at this point because a lot of stuff, the student is identified in many ways with their social, and there's beginning to become these mandatory reporting laws whereby if you have a compromise and some of this data is laid bare, you need to report it. And there was an incident that occurred in California, probably in the past 2 months, where I think it was a financial aid laptop or an admissions laptop that got lost. Had several thousand students' information on it, and they had to report it. Now, the thief that took it may not have known what he had. After they reported it, he did. It's a double-edged sword. The integrity is the integrity of your information. That what you have stays intact. You don't want things like, say, socials or credit card numbers messed with on the site. And if you are staking your reputation on this being correct, you want it to remain correct so people cannot trade off it. And then availability. You obviously want your stuff to become available. And typically, you can get hacked for political reasons to take down the availability of your stuff. You can also get availability attacks when they're trying to leverage something else going on in your site. And it's called the CIA of data protection. The other point that we look at when we talk about defense in depth is the authorization models, if you will. And there's three components to this. There's the identity, there's the authentication, and then there's authorization. And the identity, well, why do we have authentication? If we have authentication and ID, why do we need authorization? And I was thinking about this, and the best way I can relate to it is just because Tom Bruce can say that he's, authenticate to one of the servers that he's Tom Bruce, shouldn't mean that he's authorized to do this stuff. There's some things you should do, but that's why, because even though you can prove your identity, does not mean that you are necessarily authorized to do everything. This goes to the least privilege model. So you should only have the privileges that you need to get your job done and not more. So authorization goes to giving you only the amount that you need to get your job done, even though you can prove your identity, you should not necessarily be able to do. It doesn't give you the keys to the key. Typical authentication in a perfect world. Authentication is something you know, something you have, and something you are. And the best way I can describe this currently is if you're looking at popular television these days, you see the commercial with Lee Majors on it, the little bionic finger, the IBM laptop. That's something you are, something you know as a password. And then there's the something you have, a key of some sort. And my wife does government work, and you can kind of roll two of these together. There's the little RSA key fob. This is an example. Little RSA key fobs that circulate, that change this little key, this little series of numbers on it, and it's synced. It's time synced with whatever laptop you have. So at any given point in the day, when you log onto your laptop, she has to enter her password, and she has to enter this numeric digit at the end of it. I think it's 6 characters at the end of it. And that fulfills two of these requirements. It's something you know, your password, and it's something you have in your possession, which is that key fob. And then the something you are is difficult. That's usually biometric. But again, I mean, it's possible to do, and it's even becoming common. Another part of the model is data classification. We classify our data with different levels of sensitivity. You see this most importantly in the government, where they have different classifications: top secret, secret, sensitive. And we do that because we classify and label the data because we can't protect it all equally. There's some data that requires more protection than others. Taking the example of the Social Security number again, they probably should be encrypted. I recently had an interaction with a financial institution with whom I know something about the way that it works in the background. And the officers of the financial institution were getting closed account information in an unencrypted PDF through regular mail. Through regular email. And that just, I went and had a chat with these people, and it's simply a bad idea. That is secret information. If you're going to send it, that's important. You label it as sensitive, you encrypt it, you send it along. So that would be an idea of differing information. It's not as sensitive as saying I'll be at the corner of 5th and Main and sending that. The idea of threats. All this wouldn't be necessary if we didn't feel slightly paranoid about who and what was out there looking and wanting what we have. And a threat is any activity that represents a potential danger to you. They come in different forms and from disparate sources. What I mean by that is they can come from inside, outside. It can be somebody that walks something physical through your, whatever you want to call your perimeter, your wire, gets into your internal network absolutely innocently in many cases. It could be that somebody in Taiwan has just swiveled their sites that you weren't looking at. And you can't protect against it all. And one of the rules that we try to extol is that you protect against the ones that are most likely. You at least get the low-hanging fruit out of the way. And on the other hand, you also get what's most worrisome to you. You obviously have in your head what you want to protect, the things that are sensitive and most worrisome to you, whether it be a matter of integrity or confidentiality or availability. You choose which one of those is most important to you. And you realize that even though the bar may be pretty high, your life is going to be a lot better if you do protect against it. You're going to be a lot more at peace with what you do. And more to the point, you'll have done your due diligence. The reality of it is that we're more and more responsible for the security of our site and the information entrusted to us. And I don't really think that it's going to be too far off before we start seeing legal action for being liable for, at least not doing due diligence for protecting what's been entrusted. A vulnerability in this model is a weakness that allows a threat to occur. And you have to have the threat and the vulnerability must be paired. You don't really have one without the other. You can still be vulnerable, but it doesn't matter if there's nothing swiveled at you looking at you. And it can be prevented. You can prevent the vulnerability. You can prevent the vulnerability if you know about the vulnerability. And since this is the open source conference, this starts a little religious war over what's better, an open source or a closed source model for getting this information to you. I mean, if you know about it, you can prevent it. Well, then how do you know about it? Is Microsoft going to tell you? They'll go when they're good and ready. But on the other hand, the open source model that's laid bare for all to see. And the reality of it is that the vulnerabilities are discovered largely in the programs that we use, not by somebody picking apart code. Somebody who knows how to look at code will pick it apart and find the one piece of code that they know will cause a buffer overflow, for example. But in large part, it's taken by just somebody taking a piece of code and throwing trash at it until it breaks in a predictable manner, and then writing an exploit that does it without knowing the internal workings of it at all. This is a very esoteric, it's a very simple equation, but it's very esoteric, because you can't put a number to it. You assess your risk based on your threat that you assume, times any vulnerability or exposure you have. And you don't ever really assign numeric values to this, that you would find it very difficult to assign. This is more of a guidepost to you for assessing your risk in your organization. And generally speaking, it is something that you would use to give yourself comfort. I mean, you would know how forward-facing you are, and you would assume what threats you have available to you, and you would make decisions based on it. The threat model, this is a top-down kind of threat model. You would assume the threat, you would assume your vulnerability, and then those two things combined would give you a compromise of whatever you hold dear. You can substitute that with, in one word, something called an exploit. Threat, vulnerability, and then you have a compromise, and that's the top-down threat model. The origins of a threat, there are quite a few. The two basic that we usually talk about are an external threat coming from the outside, somebody looking at you wanting to do a remote exploit on your site, or an internal threat, something inside the wire. These are more nefarious and they're actually harder to pin down. An internal threat can come from somebody's innocent as walking into your perimeter, plugging into an unprotected jack inside your building, and having their machine be infected with a worm. And then they're already inside your organization at that point. Any checks and balances you put in to keep somebody like that out from the inside, they're already halfway inside your perimeter. And the external threats are easier to conceptualize. That's some bad guy somewhere looking at you doing, wanting to do you ill. We go back to the nested circles on the very most outside layer, and we assume an external attack. Usually the first line of defense would be an organizational firewall. And then the other ones that are typically used these days are something called an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system. We're going to look at each one of these just a little more in detail. Firewall is typically an inline device. It sits between somewhere usually high up on your network hierarchy. And it controls traffic coming into your organization based on a set of rules. Rules are usually top-down. They can be exclusatory. For example, somebody with IP address and a specific IP address is allowed to touch port 21 on this machine on the other side of the firewall. Or somebody without a specific IP address would not be allowed to touch port 21 on the side of the firewall, port 21 being FTP. Therefore, only the person that needs to get access to that resource would have it. They can be state or stateless. And what I mean by state or stateless is they can track a conversation so they will know whether you're shining them on. In other words, they usually look at something called a stateless firewall. Usually looks at something called a SYN packet. That's the first packet that's usually part of a TCP handshake. It's a three-way handshake. A stateless firewall doesn't care whether it's keeping track of this stream of data. It takes one look at it and says, you're a SYN packet from somebody I'm not supposed to talk to, so I'm not going to. But it only looks at the SYN packet. And you can do something called packet corruption. It's very easy to do, to generate a packet which is not the first packet, which is the first packet supposedly in a conversation, that doesn't have the SYN flag set, that will pass easily through a stateless firewall. It only looks at the SYN packet, so you could potentially, and it comes back to reconnaissance, you can send packets through a firewall with the FIN bit set, it's different than the SYN, and get a response from machines that are supposedly protected by a firewall with a stateless firewall. They've largely fell out of vogue. In the Linux world, there was something called IP chains several years ago, and it may still be in use. It was a stateless firewall. It only worked on looking at the SYN packets, the first part of the TCP handshake. A stateful firewall understands and follows a conversation. So if it sees a FIN packet comes in and it knows it's not part of an ongoing network communication, it says, hey, wait a minute, you didn't send me. We have never established a handshake. This is a bogus packet. I'm not going to respond or let you through. And in some ways, you can even have the firewall say, a lot of times what you'll see is that it will be filtered. The firewall, the response you get on the other end when you try to send one of these things is you watch for the program that you're using, the port, you have to say that this has been filtered. There are ways to make the firewall say, when you see this, and it's not part of a conversation that's going on, just drop it. Just send it a reset. Don't reply at all. It's not valid. And that worked for a while. And then people got more clever and they decided you could corrupt packets, right, that actually had other bits set in this. There's something called a Christmas tree scan. You light up all the bits on a packet. So you light up FIN, SYN, SYNAC, the fragmentation packet, all this stuff, you light it up. And it's called a Christmas tree scan, and a lot of the firewalls didn't know how to handle it, so they just passed it. But we've gotten past that now. At this point, you could a good stateful firewall will not allow you to pass corrupted packets through within reason. I mean, there are still ways you can sneak stuff through. You can spoof it kind of and then listen on the other end. But generally speaking, the stateful firewalls is what you're going to see these days, protecting your organization. And that brings to the last bullet point on this slide, which is proactive versus a reactive firewall. The dogma tells security folks that at this point in time, you do the most restrictive set of rules you can have. You start with a default deny policy. You start by denying all traffic into your organization. And then you only allow the traffic through that you know is needed. And it's difficult to set up a rule set like that, especially if you walk into an organization that hasn't had a firewall before. So you wind up sitting there with a packet sniffer on the network for a couple days, being a packet monkey and tracing down what everybody's doing, what this weird traffic looks like, who's talking to whom. I've been in academia for a while, and the reality of it is that since academia prides itself on open communication, typically what you see is a reactive firewall. It's a firewall that lets everything through, and it will only stop traffic when it's a known bad. Usually by that time, it's too late. Which is why a lot of times you will see individual organizations within, say, university, throw up their own firewall. And it becomes important for people that handle sensitive data that are mandated by law to take care of things. So you will get a firewall that has a default deny policy, say, in front of the med school, because they are handling patient data and are required by law to keep that stuff private. But typically, what I've seen in the past is the reactive firewalls at the organization level. They'll let everything through until they see known bad. And then they'll start blocking stuff, and more to the point, they'll usually start blocking stuff from both sides. So you'll all of a sudden see things stop being able to go out for no reason. The IDS versus IPS. What an IDS is called an intrusion detection system. They've been around for a long time. It's all rules based, so you'll only catch threats that you know about, and that's typical for this kind of stuff. There are patches that do statistical analysis. It's very esoteric. I don't know that we want to get into that right now, or I know I don't have time to get into it. What an IDS does, it sits as a watcher on your network. it can sit anywhere in your network, but it has to be able to see the traffic. Since most of it's gone over to switched instead of shared, it just can't be a box anymore. It just sits in your office and sees all the traffic on your LAN sync. Typically what it has to do is it has to hang off your switch on a span port or something else that sees traffic. And it watches all the traffic coming in and out of your organization. And it matches all that traffic to a set of rules that you give it. And it will take, based on what it sees on the wire and the rules that you give it, it'll do something. And typically what an IDS is good for is telling you that something has occurred. It could have occurred very recently, even in the form of nanoseconds, but it's just really good for reporting to you. It has a very limited responsibility. Very limited responsibility. And what I mean by that is there's a package out there called Snort, and it's an open source IDS. It now has IPS capability. And it has something called an active response technology built into it. And what it will do is you can make it put packets on the wire based on what it sees in its rule set. The most common thing to make it do is to spoof a reset when it sees something naughty. Is to spoof a reset to both the sender of the packet and the receiver of the packet, thereby tearing down the connection immediately. A reset packet will tear down the connection immediately. It will if the guy on the other end hasn't taught his network stack to ignore reset. And then it'll just keep going and ignore your reset. So you spoof it to your side as well. Of course, this is after it's already seen some naughty traffic on your network. And the guys programming the exploits are getting better at encoding their exploits inside of one packet. So that packet whizzes by the IDS. The IDS goes, hey, wait a minute. And by that time, the exploit is already hit. And it will work to a degree if that exploit does something like open up a shell on the machine that it attacked. It doesn't work if it just, quote unquote, executes arbitrary code, which is what most of the shells of the exploit you see will allow you to do. It will allow you to plug in whatever you want this particular exploit to do. And there's what is it called, Metasploit? Package that they call Metasploit, which will allow you to cruft your own exploit and insert whatever arbitrary code you would like into the exploit that it has just generated for. And IPS is different. An IPS sits in line in the network like your firewall would. It usually sits downstream of your firewall, although again this is given to a lot of people like to see everything that's coming at their organization. The problem is that the box works really hard, and IPS works really hard. It's looking at all the traffic coming through. It's doing exactly what it layered security. It looks at all the traffic coming through, and is making decisions based on that traffic, just like an IDS would be. However, what an IPS does is it actually controls the flow of traffic in and out of your organization based on matching rules. This box works really hard because it has to decide whether to let this packet go through, modify this packet so that it's harmless, or take some other action based on what it sees. This kind of gets around the one-packet exploit to a degree. What it will do is it will stop, if it sees that one-packet exploit come through, instead of just watching it whiz by and then raising its hands and saying it just saw an exploit go by, it stops it before it gets into your network. And then it sets off all kind of bells and whistles, and then it alerts you that it happened. And it can report response to known threats, which means it'll do exactly what the IDS does. On the other hand, it will actually stop the threat from entering. These boxes work really hard. They're expensive to put in because they have to be really large. And they're only effective if you maintain them. Again, it works off of a signature-based model. So you have to go in there pretty much several times a day and adjust your signatures so that you know if the newest threat comes out, you responded to it within a decent amount of time. It's also open source. The code for writing your own filters is published, so you can write your own filters. If you want to shut off FTP traffic to your entire 5th floor, you can do that pretty easily. And the reason I mention this is because it can bite you in the foot. The Internet Explorer, as an example, Internet Explorer you can FTP to sites using Internet Explorer. Instead of using HTTP, you do FTP:// Well, for whatever reason, Internet Explorer likes to throw a lot of no-op packets out when it does that. Watch it on the wire. A no-op packet is what exploit writers use to pad their code when they're trying to do a buffer overflow attack. So if you're trying to make a connection to download a file using IE, and all of a sudden you wind up getting your connection terminated and terminated and terminated and terminated, it's because somebody has this IDS, like this, because somebody has an IDS running in the background and seeing all these null packets, assuming that something nefarious is coming, and spoofing and resetting both you and the site you're trying to attach. Host level protection, the next layer down from network. This is the actual physical box that whatever you are trying to protect is on. And then, you have to decide what you're protecting. And is it important what you're protecting? Are you protecting a server? Are you protecting a desktop? Are you protecting a single-use machine? Are you protecting a machine that multiple people use? And there's no magic formula to this. I mean, you educate yourself on the tools that are available to you, and you use them. For an example, if you're protecting a desktop box, and your organization has virus filtering at your mail server level, don't remove the virus protection from your client's desktop because it's so good at the top layer. You assume that somehow, someday, something is going to get through, that the desktop level virus protection is going to catch. There's a couple ways, just a couple general rules for protecting a host. One is to control the flow of data in and out of your host. Do this in a couple of ways, and you can actually ape the same model that you use for network protection. You can install a personal firewall, or what you consider a personal firewall, or a host firewall, we should call it, on whatever box you have. That will allow you to stop malicious stuff you would consider malicious. As an example, we have a problem with the LII about people unkindly crawling. They'll ignore the robots.txt file and just smack the bejesus out of us, crawling all through the site, picking up whatever they can. And it comes from a variety of sources, but it puts load on the server, and it apes a denial of service attack for us. It cranks the server now, especially one of the older ones we have. And what we do is we have an IP tables firewall. It's relatively restricted at this point, and we just drop their IP address and ignore all traffic from them. And I don't care whether they know they've been filtered or not. And then standard procedure is for me to drop these guys a wire somehow and ask them if there's some way that we can help them. The other rule that we typically use to implement protection is to ensure the integrity of the box. Using the model of least permission, you limit the authority that people have on it. They only have the authority that they need to get their job done. Typically strong passwords. There's something in the Linux world now called Linux SE Linux. It's actually an NSA. It's an NSA procedure, I should say. And for those of you who've done Novell before, it starts to ape the Novell permissions now in Linux. It's a little cryptic, and there's quite thick books written on it, and I cannot say that I have mastered it yet. And it comes installed by default on the Red Hat Core products these days. And what it means is that even if you elevate your privileges, the quest that a hacker would have, say, on a Linux box is root. Root's the Uber user on a Linux box. And even though you may be able to elevate your privileges to root, that doesn't necessarily give you, it still remembers who you are. You inherited the rights from whoever you were before you were root, and it knows to not let you, say, see the password file. It won't allow you read access to the password file. And that would be the limiting authority on the box. And it actually adds a nice, because there's only so many permissions bits in Linux, and it gets really frustrating to try and work them out. So this was put into place so that you could actually assign roles to people on the servers you needed to. And then the other part of it, is detect changes in your system. One way or the other, you have to know what was there previously so that you know what has changed. So one of the tools that typically gets used, it's a little older tool, there's better stuff out there, something called Tripwire. Again, this is an open source Linux tool. And there are things that exist like this in the Windows world as well. And what it does is it goes through your server and it creates MD5 password hashes of all the files it finds. And then once a day, it sleazes back through your server and matches, and it re-encrypts, rehashes those files and checks it against what it knows, and the known good hash. If something changes, it tells you. And it's a pain. You have to tune it. You have to tell it what to look at, what to look at. And not only that, but those original password hashes, the known good, you have to secure somehow. So typically what you would do is put them in a write-only state, and that usually doesn't mean putting them on your hard disk. You usually burn them on a CD or something. Make them go get them from a server you know to be secure. And then compare the two, because if the hacker gets in, the first thing he'll do, so that you don't realize what he's changed, is he'll wreck your original hashes if he finds them on your system. And you can't just hide them. That doesn't protect you that much. There's been some talk these days of hiding them in GIF files, some stenography. You actually hide your hashes. I don't know. I'm sure I like it. Better to have them. Tools. I put this slide and started thinking about it. This was specifically tools that you would use on your host to keep stuff secure, but it speaks to a little larger philosophy too, is that hackers have toolkits they use. They have a little bag of tricks they reach into when they want something, when they want to get something yours. They pull it out and they use this tool. Everything from automatic expert writers to auto routers to port scanners to whatever. And it's important that you develop your own toolkit as well. And I mean, I could present the 75 tools that you must have. The reality is you use whatever works for you. What can work for you in the Windows world is different can work for you in the Linux world. Some of them are the same, and you should find the tools the hackers use. You should at least familiarize yourself with them so that you know what it looks like from the other end of the barrel. And indeed, some of these tools work to help protect you as well. You should port scan your own system. Guy port scans his own systems every 10 minutes. And that's the way he detects if something bad is bad. And then he has detected that more than once. An odd port opens up that he knows he didn't open up. He knows he's got a compromise. A lot of honeypots do that. They'll scan themselves every 10 minutes or so to make sure that they don't do it. Honeypot is a box you set up to attract hackers. It's an interesting way to watch their mind work, if you will. There's all kinds of stuff. But you only don't. Forget I said that, because you don't need to do honeypots unless you've got everything. You get everything else right before you do the honeypot. And there's all kinds of tools. But a couple of tools that you would use on your host is the host firewall. You can use a host IDS. They do actually, and the host IDS works a lot less hard on a host than it does on a network. A host IDS is only looking at the traffic bound for your particular box, and it can be a great way of it's just another layer of protection for you. And actually, one of my favorite programs in the world is a program called Snort, which is an open source IDS. It is now an open source IPS as well. There was a really popular module or plugin for this Snort called Snort Inline, and that allowed it to become an IPS. It would sit in line in your network just like I described an IPS would work. And now it's in the beta build of the new Snort. It's actually included into it. I highly recommend you play with it. It's cryptic. You got to have time to play with it, but it's actually pretty rewarding. And you can actually now, there is a version of Snort, still open source, for a Windows box. And again, this is something that, as long as you don't do reactive response, you really can't shoot yourself in the foot, but it's a way you can eat up a lot of your time, because it is pretty cool. On a host box, whether it be a server, whether it be a desktop, this is maybe more apropos to desktops, is encryption. A lot of people don't realize it, but Windows XP had two very nice security features that a lot of people have paid a lot of money to get before. The first is triple DES encryption, and the second is IPsec. It comes enabled with the IPsec VPN. The encryption is relatively easy to turn on. It's also relatively easy to hurt yourself. And what that means is that when you log on to your server, it uses the credentials that you logged on with to decrypt this directory that you've protected seamlessly to you. You don't realize it's done it. You realize you turned it on because you have to turn it on. But as soon as your machine is done booting, that directory is available to you. If you then log off and somebody else logs on, they can see the directory, but they couldn't see what was in it. The downside to the Windows model, unless it's changed, and I don't think it has, is that unless the key is escrowed, and something happens to your hard disk, you will lose that data in that very important directory that you choose to encrypt. There's no master key to it. There's no backdoor to it. If you turn on encryption, if you turn on, make this folder private, which is, they don't tell you, but that's what encrypts the data in that folder. If you turn that on and you somehow lose the key, if your hard disk goes bad, and unless your system has escrowed the key, you're not getting that stuff back. It's an excellent way of sanitizing your entire hard disk. And the other thing we can use, and this is a server-side thing, typically is log watchers. Logs can be very verbose, and I don't know many sysadmins, myself included, that like to spend a lot of time looking at them, although it's so necessary to do. And I typically reserve some time. I got to have to do this a couple years ago on Friday, of going back through my logs and looking at them, whether I've had an event or not. And I give them a pretty thorough look over for stuff. Again, it's not my favorite thing to do, but even if I've had nothing go wrong that week, even if I'm not suspicious of anything, I go through on Friday, take a couple hours, my sleeves through the logs and look to make sure I'm not getting something I've missed, something that didn't cause an error. But there are things you can, but other than you watching the log, there are things that you can implement to watch the logs for you and then alert you when it sees something not quite right. If you see a lot of logging attempts within X period of time, it can alert you that you probably have a dictionary attack on your phone, which are so common these days. It would really annoy you to turn that on, but it's a good example of what they can do. Application level protection. This is where a lot of the exploits come in. This is the actual flaws in the code of whatever program you're running on your box, whatever it may be. And the reality of it is that even in the commercial closed source industry, there's a lot of bad code. There's quite a bit of bad code out there. It comes from people being sloppy. It comes from beta stuff that makes it to production without a good quality assurance. It's some guy under a deadline that has to get something done, and he knows how to do it this way, but doesn't know how to do it securely. But nobody cares anyway because closed source can see it. And again, this is the religious war. It's why open source is good. I subscribe to the model that's better for me to be able to look at the code, and it's for me not to be able to look at the code. If you can educate yourself enough to know what you're looking at, it's better to have that available to you. Not only is it better to have it available to you personally, but as far as having it available to the community, yes, they're more likely to have stuff found. It's also more likely to get fixed quickly if the source is open. You're more likely to be able to just patch it yourself if you absolutely positively had to, or for there to be different versions of the patch that would come out. But regardless, being able to see the code probably does more good than harm in the end. Finding flaws, I went over a little earlier. Typically, the way you would a penetration tester would find a flaw is not so much to pick apart the code and look through thousands of lines of code for that one line that's going to cause a flaw. You will look. You can look for stuff in there that are known bads, known to not check for parameters when you write to the stack, and you would do that ahead of time. But usually, you wind up finding exploits and things simply by streaming what I called the garbage before. You know what you're sending it, but you're sending it all this stuff, and at the point where it breaks, you know what you sent it. And at that point in time, you found a flaw in it. Whether that can be capitalized for nefarious reasons, it would remain to be seen. But you found a flaw in the program which a person who was inclined to could potentially find a flaw. And I put the computer as a weapon in here because I like this analogy. I do a lot of computer gaming when I have the time. And if you guys ever played some first-person shooters, you know that you have these gradients of weapons. You usually start out in the game with a Bowie knife. And then at the end of the game, you usually wind up with something called a BFG. And Windows 95 was the Bowie knife. And Linux is the BFG. If at the point in time that your computer is compromised, that thing becomes a weapon. It's very benign when it's sitting there. Nobody's problem when it's doing what it should be doing. But the moment in time that gets compromised, especially these days, and this is including Windows boxes because they're a lot more powerful than they used to be, that machine becomes a weapon. and that weapon could be sitting on your desktop or your server. The last thing that you want is somebody calling you up, hinting that you have a weapon in your server because somebody has compromised it and is now scanning their subnet to see if they've got a MySQL port. Application layer stuff, again, a very common attack. This is an example of what an application attack would look like. It's something called a buffer overflow. And then, well, the first bullet point is, what is an exploit or a hack? And everybody has a definition of what an exploit or a hack is. I've developed my own overview. And what it is breaking something to cause a predictable outcome. You cause something to behave in a manner that it's not supposed to, but you do so in a way that you can predict the outcome of breaking. So therefore, you can cause it to execute. Typically, what you cause it to do is execute arbitrary code. And the buffer flow is one example of bad code. And we're trying to keep this simple and describing a stack. Perhaps not a simple thing. When you run through a program, any data you feed it, say you give it a password. That password is contained in a buffer. That buffer is written to a stack. And a stack is the way that a computer keeps where all information could. You put stuff on a stack, you pop stuff off a stack. And the stack is usually executable. A buffer overflow occurs when, say, I enter a password, and I'm only supposed to enter 15 characters as a password. I enter 56 characters as a password. That gets pushed to the stack. The computer starts reading it, and part of that data that exceeds the 15 characters is executed as if it was actual code. And that's a very simplistic version of the way a buffer overflow works, but that's basically it. The prevention is the prevention is to write good code, but you can't guarantee that's going to happen. There are a couple ways to prevent against this, and this is just an example of how to prevent an application layer attack. Is to make the stack non-executable. In some cases you can do this. In many cases we'll break whatever you've got going on. There have been some less intrusive and somewhat less effective ways of preventing buffer overflows. I was actually relatively pleased to see that Red Hat Core does this, and some of my pages may know of other distros that do this. But Red Hat will introduce something called stack wobble, so that the hacker has to work a lot harder at hitting this target in memory. The spot in which it will actually execute code is deliberately injected with a little bit of chaos, so that it's much harder for the hacker to code an exploit that will hit this spot. They typically have to wind up using a lot of no-op packets, which usually a lot of no-ops into a packet, which sometimes will actually cause the packet to fragment. And in any case, should be some indication to you that you have something going on if you're watching the traffic. And even if you're not watching the traffic, the chances of them actually hitting this spot, this executable spot on the stack, are greatly minimal. So I'll conclude it, and I said in my little brief that I gave to John that I would put scary statistics, and not to be a fear monger, mainly because I find them interesting. And one of the reasons we would use layer protection. The Melissa virus was seen on a Friday. That same Friday, the security community kicked in, and by that Friday afternoon, there was a description and a mitigation procedure released. Nobody read it. By the following Monday, 100,000 machines were infected. Now this is a virus. It was a macro virus that required user intervention. They had to physically click on something to get the stats. And still, by the end of the weekend, 100,000 machines. A couple years later, a couple of worms came out. Code red, infected 37,000 machines an hour, and Blaster infected 21,000. So, if you're wondering why you should invest any time at all in doing this, in an organization the size of the ones we typically exist in, this will be all through you, and this stuff will be all through you in no time. There's no other reason to implement a layered security policy is so that so you don't have a bad Monday. I'm done with the formal stuff, I will happily take questions.
I have a question now. What we've run into, what we've basically done for a disaster recovery plan, and we've actually done it twice, and we've actually written in that if there's a fire pad, it looks like it's hitting the network, we isolate ourselves, just unplug it in.
Yeah.
Shut down the network, unplug the server.
No, it's called an air gap. And one of the scariest things I ever heard in my life was a story about the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is controlled by Microsoft operating system that are not air gap. So if somebody should decide one day and has a skill set that they want both oceans level.
Actually, so is NWA, Northwest Airlines.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually just flew on them, and I made a comment flying out of the airport. Wow, that's weird because the Microsoft logo was floating around on the big screen. And I said, man, that's scary. On the return trip, from the city I was flying from, their entire reservation system was down. All their computers were down.
Yeah.
When we got in, theirs were down. So across the United States, at least, they were shut down for some reason.
There's I joke, I shouldn't joke. Certain 767 airplanes have something built into them that will land them in bad weather. It's a computerized system that will land them in bad weather. And every time I jump on one of these things, I'm like, in bad weather, 767 is fixing that. I hope this is not a Microsoft-driven OS. Because you don't want a BSOD at like 12,000 feet.
I've been part of doing web stuff since before there was web servers and the like. When the first web server came out, we loaded Linux on a variety of machines over the years. It was distributed just on 5.25 inch floppy.
Right, yeah.
Over the years, we built Linux servers, you name it, every flavor
Right.
we've built, maintained, tried to make secure. And at the height of our Linux servers, we had 15 or so hardcore Linux servers serving up wide area network, a variety of partners, and
Right.
still have a whole bunch of partners now doing what we do. But I wanted to share this with you just to, it's like here's the Microsoft versus Linux thing. And I can't tell you how many weekends I spent working on security issues and dealing with Linux-associated security issues. I've concluded that any open source, just the opposite way, any open source distribution is in the balance the most susceptible to some issue, because too much is known out there.
No, you're right.
And when I flip most, not all, you can't flip everything over to Linux account. In my experience, you can try, but you can't get everything. When you flip it over to Linux UK, what I do know is my life became easier. Ultimately, I know that's a horrible thing to admit, but I'll say it. There was a lot less weekends. It was easier ultimately to keep rolling.
Right.
In my experience, most of the hardcore bad stuff you got launched in a Ubuntu K direction was typically defacement stuff. It wasn't one of the where you had root cases, and all that stuff. And you got, and I challenge you, those of you in the Linux environment, this is the challenge. You go out and you get Ethereal, you get your choice of client tool. You probably got Linux machines in your segment, you probably got Ubuntu K machines, and you just sit out there, you just watch those packets. And you tell me after a while which machine is getting the most targeted stuff.
Well, right now on us, it's IIM.
But I just challenge those of you. Now, the other thing to watch for, the other commonality I think that exists is you've got a high-end production machine that is highly visible. I mean, there's huge differences between a highly visible machine and one that's not visible. So what I meant to say is machines that are visible, that
Right.
the whole world knows.
No.
Not your little teeny printer.
No, but I mean, one of the reasons I like the open source model is because, I mean, you're right. People are looking at the code all the time, but it's the good guys and the bad guys looking at the code. And I mean, and this doesn't occur so much anymore because Microsoft really has, and I'm not anti-Microsoft. I mean, actually, they spent and are spending, well, they cut back a little bit, a lot of money on making their stuff more secure. The .NET framework was built from the ground up with security in mind. I don't know how successful it's been. I don't know, maybe of one exploit that's available in the model that does something actually about it. But I guess it's just personal preference. I mean, we have been running Linux shops for a while. It's a lot easier. The Windows stuff to me was coming, at least to us, with it wouldn't make you set an administrative password on you. It wouldn't necessarily enforce strong password stuff for you. So again, it's like I said before, it almost comes down to religious. The one thing I will say, just to step away from that for a second, is a couple, and I've heard a lot of people say this, and it's so terribly wrong. Just because we exist in academia doesn't mean we're a fat, juicy target, and it's whatever the people are trying to get in trials. And typically what we've seen in academia is a big fat bandwidth pipe and almost no protection on that bandwidth pipe. So a lot of the exploits that you see in academia are people just want your bandwidth. Friend you more.
The undergrad school I worked in, computer science department was given their own server. It made the professor who was in charge of it, hey, I'm going to watch it, take care of it, I'll secure it. He basically installed Slackware 7.1 straight out of the box, didn't say anything. 3 months later, the FBI knocked on the door.
Yeah.
China was hacking Russia.
Yeah.
Using our T1s.
Yeah. I did an inadvertent experiment with a 1UK box model. I was setting it up for something, and then something some shiny got twirled around it. And I left it for a day to get back to it. And, by the time I had gotten back to it, it was hacked. So that I had been in the trade. And that was the French one.
Yeah, I kind of really did get my question before. I'm kind of telling you how we did
I'm sorry.
there. And we've had the luxury of being able to do that. We only got about 14 servers.
Yeah.
So we can do that. Now, since the rest, especially on campus, we don't have the luxury of being able to do that. What is really the best way to handle it?
You mean a large-scale attack coming across the internet? Well, it depends on what kind of attack it is. If it's a worm, you can usually stop whatever port is coming in on at a firewall. If you have a choke point for a firewall, if you have no firewall and you have no way to mass update your machines, if there is indeed a patch out, you're kind of in bad shape. There's really no way you can mitigate it. You have to have the infrastructure in place beforehand. But typically there'll be a vector that the stuff comes in on. If you can identify the vector that is coming in on, whether it be a specific virus signature, whether it be an exploit launched over a specific port, because they usually do follow relatively common. It's usually hard-coded information. Typically, you do not find something that jumps ports too much in an exploit code. Well, I mean, usually a DMZ is part of a firewall. DMZ is someplace that your outward-facing servers would sit. For those of you that know, it's a place where your outward-facing servers sit in kind of a firewall model. But yeah, I mean, that would keep your outward-facing stuff only facing, but that still leaves you exposed. But the firewall is malleable. I mean, it's rules-based. So if you can identify the vector the stuff is coming in from, and you know that the attack is going on, and again, you have to know. As I said before, you got to know what the threat is, what the vulnerability is. You can stop it. I mean, you can quick filter the port 444, or the RPC, which shouldn't really have open to big world.
Most of the experience that I've had with security issues and whatnot have been at the application level, as opposed to the OS and stuff like that.
Right.
People going in, executing SQL injection through web pages that aren't doing client-side, server-side validations.
Right. Yeah.
Things like that, or not locking down like SQL Server so that they can take advantage of extended server procedures and use a domain account to execute netclants and stuff like that. And I was really surprised in starting off in an organization going in and looking at some of the shrink wrap packages that are out there in the law community and how vulnerable they are.
Yeah, it's true. And the only way to be sure, because again, if it's closed source, you can't go and look at the code. The only way to be sure is to load it up and do exactly what a hacker would do. To probe the bejesus out of yourself. I mean, do everything, launch your code. Yeah.
To go back to Mark's point, which I think he was making as far as server reliability, and I know that Washburn's gone through a big transition going over to Windows. Maybe what we're seeing is that it's no longer wise to put up a Linux box without vendor supplied patches. that what you're not able to do anymore is drop a Slackware box on the network or drop a Fedora core box on the network without making sure that you're getting updates regularly. And it's probably worth the $400 or whatever it is you pay Red Hat now. I mean, it's just that as the market has matured, we probably wouldn't deploy Linux servers with kind of the wild abandon we were doing it, 5 years ago. And so I would think, Mark, that a modern, the usual stuff, a maintained Linux box, which is probably an automatically maintained Linux box, just like an automatically maintained Windows box, is likely to be relatively similarly secure today.
Yeah, I have to admit, if you did the full-blown package with Red Hat, we really did that. But there's a fair number of costs associated with that. And I know in law schools, like everybody else who tries to economize. I only want to share that because I think many of you are on the same boat we are, and I would just hate somebody down that same path thinking they could pull something off the net anymore and rely on it out of the box. You really can't.
No, well, there's nothing you should rely on out of the box.
I disagree. SUSE 9.3, 9.3, 9.3, SUSE Pro, out of the box, secure, maintained. I think they just cut off maintenance for 8.0, which is.
But what was the
2.5 years old.
SUSE just got the certification, right? It is.
Yeah.
It's got gold certification as far as.
And it was with SE Linux.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and then the educational or nonprofit licensing on SUSE Enterprise even is
Yeah,
less than $200
Yeah.
for a dual processor.
If you're in a belt shop, we are.
It comes with your stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually something people may not be aware of. It's worth repeating. That if you have an ALA with Novell, you're going to get SUSE for free essentially.
That's the enterprise version of it.
And the patches, which is the critical thing. And again, going back to Mark's good point about patching and how critical that is.
But even there out of the box, when you buy it, CompUSA, it's patched automatically. Before that long. I think it's 2.5 years.
The only caveat I would just recommend is if you can, go with the LDAP for authentication.
Oh, yeah.
Because it makes a difference.
It's even for law clinics. Law clinics, to me anyway, pose a certain dilemma, and that is you've got to totally protect that client data, make it utterly secure, and yet at the same time, as a law school, you have to kind of watch the data for abuses internally. And of course, since those are real clients, you really can't. So I find myself kind of navigate the extent to which I should exercise watchful control of law clinic stuff. How is everybody else handling law clinic? Do you just stick it behind a firewall and just don't look at it anymore?
Well, I guess, part of it will depend on what your reportability is. If you're out in California, you need to take all kinds of costs for that. Just out of due diligence, I would probably start using some kind of encryption. Myself, I don't do that. So somebody else may be able to speak to it.
Anybody wants to talk about law clinics? See me, we're in the process of a change.
Cornell right now. Yeah. The legal information is not really good. We do see all of the local stuff. The LIS and I was with Emory for about 9 years as well. Relatively recent. Thank you. It takes some. I've done a lot of it. It takes a while to get. You know, it's not like yeah, they were probably doing it. They usually fix it. It takes 6 years. it's not like it's cheap. I mean, it's a couple $1,000. Boy, they're good at what they do. They're really good at communicating with folks. I highly recommend it. And it's not really that specific. I mean, you can take firewall, intrusion, the very basic stuff. It's really quite good. I've never been.
It's like global. Like they have some new black hat companies, like it's attended by it's a good black
Still got more materials you get out of it. But take a look at CIS. There's another one. Gives you a CIS feature.
I just heard fact stripped into my head, and help me remember when we get back to town that I want to talk about asterisk and facts, and I want to see what.
But if there's any way to do any training with this, again, and I guess I'm going to say
but on the other hand, you called me that when you looked nothing but good.
Bet did it all.
Nobody's come around saying, "Geez, Homer, we miss you." I haven't heard
that. The other thing you can do is if you go
although Jason did keep that intranet layout that I did like 1999 when I first got there.
I gotta tell you, he said, he said to me an awful lot.
I know, I totally understand.
We know what's funny though? Nobody even knows that's there. Really. Yeah, you started. Right, I know. No, but I mean before that.
And that will give
I don't think it was getting different.
I noticed several
Gets reports immediately.
Oh, really?
But it's good to get a whole baseline. And I know it's pain in the butt, but
you will just learn.
I left piles of stuff.
Like my dog,
Yeah, I just went and have lunch and stuff. I work at home, but my office is in like on the other side of the parking garage because the law school like ran out of space. Although that may be changed. Or I'm moving to UGA. No. I know. Yeah, I know. The guy goes to Georgia State.
It does come to you pretty easy.
No.
And the other thing is,
Now, probably, I'm still an Emory employee.
if you work nicely, it doesn't have to be big.
It's like we launder the CALI emails.
Yeah. No, they send CALI an invoice for me every month.
And you start planning a little
It's the Elmer bill. And then I said, yeah. So I have like my own budget line.
So why don't they pay you directly?
Well, it's well, yeah. I mean, no, so I mean, it's my benefits. So I've got like 5 years in because CALI doesn't employ anybody directly. Yeah. No. John works for IIT. Levon and Sam work for the University of Minnesota. Yeah. Yeah. It's because what that does is that cuts down on our overhead essentially because that outsources all of our human relations stuff, human resources stuff like and a lot of our human relations. Actually, not as much as we thought they were. I am a good deal. Actually, yeah, because that was an issue, And it turned out, I forget what it was, but it turned out to be a lot less than we thought it would be. Apparently, I'm discounted.
The other really has come with other customers. They were used to doing that kind of arrangement.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so there's some administrative overhead, but what really wrong, I don't think they kind of know.
Yeah, right. We're actually, yeah, they do. So CALI gets a bill that includes my salary, my benefits, some administrative overhead, whatever, my phone bill, all that sort of stuff. But we're CALI is officially an Emory affiliate organization.
I know.
The same as the Carter Center. Except I haven't been president.
I know. But I mean, it takes one